Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Stacy Godnick, and I'm from the College of General Studies. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Academic Life at the college. And welcome to the second annual Advising Network Advising Symposium. I'm your MC for the day, and I am so thrilled to see a room full of folks, cross-section at this university. I think every school might be represented, several units, joining us today for what we hope is going to be a fabulous day of conversation and fellowship. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking this day is a success already by the fact that we were not snowed out. But I will tell you that I had a little scare this morning as I started my car, went to my car, put my stuff in the car, started it, went back to the house to get my breakfast, came back, and my car was locked. So it was running. All the materials for the symposium were in my car. I was locked out of my house. I ran to my neighbor, got the key. Thank God he had it. This is more than you want to know, but it's a good ending, obviously. I go in, I get some matches, and I'm lighting the matches by the lock of my car to melt the lock, and I finally, obviously, was able to get it open. But I'm so glad to be here. So a little background on today's event. As I said, it's the second annual Advising Symposium. The topic for today was really generated from some feedback from last year's symposium, and we'll ask you for some feedback as well this year. So we looked at the several topics that folks recommended, and we chose meaningful advising, and we had a planning team get started on this in the fall. The structure today is also as a result of feedback that we got last year, which was that folks really enjoyed. We have about, I think, around 140, 150 people here today. We had around 120 last year, and everybody really enjoyed having time to converse with folks who they don't ordinarily speak with. They might email, they might talk on the phone, or just meet some new people at the university. So we kind of turbocharged that, and as you can see, we've assigned you to tables for the first session. And we've assigned you to tables for the second session, so we're going to have about a 10-minute, 15-minute break between the two sessions so we can rotate tables. But we're going to allow you to eat with whoever you want, so that's on you. So the goal for today is pretty much twofold. We want you to network, enjoy the fellowship of speaking with folks who are doing similar things around the university and working with our students. Excuse me. And we want you to also we've structured the day so you have some concrete takeaways, some tangible takeaways that you can bring back to your practice. We're going to delve into a lot of information. It's going to be pretty dense, so we don't anticipate that we're going to have all the answers today. We actually view today as the beginning of a conversation that will generate more conversation. So we'll have future topics for the brown bag luncheons, which many of you have attended and we'll talk about later, and for future symposiums. So that's the goal. And I just want to roll some credits ahead of time and let you know that we had over 20 people planned today. We had a steering committee, and we'll tell you some names later on, but I'd like to just give a shout out to the folks who planned today. Actually, the planning team will be distributed throughout the room as facilitators at your tables, so you'll get to meet some of them. But it's been a labor of love, so we really hope you enjoy it. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce Beth Loiseau, who's the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education, and Lori Pohl, the Vice President for Enrollment and Student Affairs. And they're going to frame today's topic of meaningful advising. Before they jump up here, I do want to make note that we should all be very thankful to them, because were it not for them, we wouldn't be here today. Over the course of the past few years, they have worked tirelessly to really bring advising to the forefront, and emphasis at the university, so that we have an opportunity to gather as colleagues to discuss what we do, how we do, why we do it. So again, this forum would not be possible without them, so I just want to give them a little hand ahead of time. And a sincere thank you. So, Beth. And by the way, we're being taped today, just so you know.
Thanks, Stacy, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second now annual Advising Symposium brought to you by the Advising Network. In addition to thanking Stacy, who, as you probably know, was the chair of all of this organizing that went into today. I also want to thank my co-chair within the advising network, Ethan Baxter, Associate Professor for Earth and Environment. I don't know that Ethan is here yet, but you will see him around later today. It's been a real pleasure leading the first couple of years of the advising network with him and seeing the ways in which the network, the members of the network have been gathering together in committees and doing all kinds of wonderful, wonderful things. Stacy promised that I would introduce the theme of meaningful advising, and I want to just start by saying that I've spent 35 years as a faculty member. I'm a member of the English department here and was at previous institutions before I arrived at BU 2.5 years ago. And 20 of those years, I spent, by choice, as the primary advisor for students from across the university, sometimes as many as 120 students at a time. And I loved my time as an academic advisor, and I consider it some of the most rewarding teaching that I have ever done. I really believe that as academic advisors, you play one of the most important roles in our students' education. Students get advice from many, many sources, as they should, from the faculty and staff in their departments, schools, colleges, from parents, from friends, from the professionals in the wonderful resource centers on campus, many of whom are here today. As academic advisors, whether professional or faculty, you have the regular and the formal opportunity to help your advisees do a number of things. And I want to just set out some of the things that I think are central to really good, meaningful academic advising. You have a chance to help them think through what they are doing here and what they want out of their educations. Many of them have never really thought that much about that. You have a chance to help them think about how, and sometimes it's whether, they're going to take advantage of the intellectual and social opportunities that BU faculty and staff have really dedicated their lives to providing for our students. And you're the ones that help them explore and to find out what they love and who they want to become. And I've actually just come from a couple of hours of reading the submissions for this year's commencement speakers. And I have to tell you that in those talks, again and again, students are coming back to conversations that they had here with advisors, with faculty, with all of the people they seek advice from, that speaking to precisely these things. They talk about how it is they found out what they really loved, what they could do well, what they knew what they were going to fail at, what they couldn't do well. And you are the ones who have that regular scheduled opportunity to help them think about those things. Sometimes, and perhaps it's often, the students want you to tell them what to do, what requirements are required for their major, what they should take this semester, when they should study abroad. They want you to be essentially a talking bulletin. It's hard to do the other. It's hard to have those important conversations that ask you about who you are and what you want to do and what you want to be. It's hard to have those meaningful conversations about their charts. It's hard to be responsible, to be an independent adult. And then, of course, I know you and they also feel the press of time. Advising sessions are short, sometimes half an hour, sometimes only 15 minutes. There feels like there's a lot to cover. How do you actually have a meaningful conversation? The advising network is working on some of these issues through a mission statement, and maybe we won't call it that many of you provided feedback on, to help kind of set the expectations for what should happen in advising so that your students may come to you better prepared to have those meaningful conversations. I think it's all of our job to resist that push towards a kind of transactional advising. You, the advisor, tell me what I need to do. We check off the boxes, and I go home, and that's the extent of the thinking. You need to know your stuff. You need to know the requirements. You need to know about UROP. You need to know where to go for internship opportunities. You need to know how to find information. And one of the things that the Advising Network is doing is trying to build a repository of that information. So if you haven't visited the Advising Network website, you might want to go there. One thing you'll find there are org charts for all of the advising mini networks inside the schools and colleges, so you can see who does what in academic advising in the schools and colleges with phone numbers, so you can call, or email addresses, so you can be in touch with other people to help make the connections for your students with your students to help get information for yourself. So you need that information, but mostly I think your job is to ask questions about the choices that your advisees face. You need to ask them, what courses are you thinking about taking next semester? Why do you want to take developmental psych? Have you considered psychology of learning? What do you want out of an education? Why do you think this course is a requirement? How are you going to supplement your courses with experiences that help to make you a societal engineer? What do you think it means to be an educated person? Many of our students have not actually asked themselves these questions, and it's important for us to ask them, to prompt their thinking. Asking these questions, I really think, is the absolute key to meaningful advising. You're going to hear more, both from Laurie and later in the sessions today, about asking questions. And I think it's key to helping us advise students along the path to becoming independent adults who are able to think for themselves. I sometimes think when we're faced with a freshman or even a sophomore or sometimes a senior, you think, oh my word, this person needs to be independent in 1 year, 2 years, 2 months. And we need to help them, not by giving them the answers, but by asking them the questions so that they can grow into the confidence that they can answer them for themselves. So today's sessions are aimed at suggesting ways to think about our students and the enterprise of helping them to become thoughtful, productive adults, about how to kind of prepare ourselves to ask those questions, and perhaps how to help our students prepare themselves for those productive conversations. I think that asking questions is a much more interesting way of being an advisor, a much more interesting and in the end a kind of fulfilling way for you to conduct those conversations as well. So I think that by asking questions, by having meaningful conversations, you actually will be a happier and more fulfilled advisor yourself. So thank you all. Enjoy the morning, and I'm going to turn things over to Laurie Pohl.
Thanks so much, Beth, Stacy, and all of the planners of this conference for inviting me to be here today. And thank you for taking time today to be together. This is just an amazing group of individuals that I see out there. So many of you from all across the campus who are dedicated to one thing, and that is helping our students succeed at BU. This is what we had always hoped for when we started an advising network and wanted to really raise the level of discourse and conversation and sharing of best practices around advising for our students. So for me personally, it's a real pleasure to be here and see something that you hoped would happen actually happen, which sometimes is a rare thing in life. So it's very heartwarming. I think today's agenda is quite interesting in a couple of ways. And when I thought about meaningful advising, there were a couple of things that came to mind. And I started to call it a shift in thinking, but I really think it's a both and. From transactional kinds of relationships to a real relationship with a student. From answering questions, being the answer bot that we sometimes have to be, to having a meaningful conversation. And I think two of the things you need for that are knowledge and empathy. And these sessions today are designed to give you both. You'll often the knowledge of millennials, why do they think this way? Why do they do the things they do? How is that different from how I'm thinking about it or how I think it should be done? And then how do I actually engage with them without actually being a millennial? And I think that's part of our challenge in a lot of cases. I think you'll gain some insight from that you can bring to your conversations. The knowledge that you'll get from how to actually have a conversation with a freshman about why they're at college, about what that might lead to, and how to open up that space of possibilities. the knowledge about how to think about planning that involves more than simply what courses one's taking in the next semester. So I see these sessions as really aimed at giving you, influencing you and providing you information that will really, that knowledge base, that empathy, that will allow you to move from transaction into relationship, and from answering questions into having a conversation. But it's not easy. As Beth noted, those conversations, those opportunities are sometimes rare and short. So I think one of the important things that I wanted to convey is that sometimes we see this, oh my gosh, there's a whole new way I need to approach this particular 10 or 15-minute conversation, or my approach with my 120 advisees, as Beth mentioned, and that can seem overwhelming. And so what I'd like to convey is leave you with the thought of what is that one additional question I can ask? And sometimes it can just be the simple word, why, in that next conversation, and build from there. Sometimes it's a question of saying, how can I make, not that I don't have enough time to do everything I need to do in this conversation, but how can I make this conversation most beneficial to us both? And kind of that reframing of that conversation, of that engagement with the student, and helps it be less of this a time sink or a burden, and hopefully a little bit more sort of biasing it towards the kinds of conversations we want to have with our students all the time. So I hope that you can see this as today as a way to recharge, but not as a day to frighten you from thinking that that everything needs to change. What are those one or two things that you could apply in a conversation, in your next series of conversations? And again, sometimes the most simple question is why. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Stacy. Thank you for being here today, and I hope you really enjoy the conversations.
Thanks, Lori, Beth. So we're going to step right into session one, and I'm just going to quickly introduce Rachel Reiser, who many of us know. She's the Assistant Dean for the Undergraduate program at the School of Management, and she's also a thought leader on the Millennial Generation. She's done workshops throughout the country and in other countries about this particular cohort of students, and she's also written a book, Millennials on Board, The Impact of the Rising Generation on the Workplace. So we have an in-house expert on our hand, who I'm going to turn it over to right now.
Am I mic'd? Yes. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. That's very kind. I am super excited to be here. I also was really fortunate to be on the planning team for the symposium, so to see it come to life like this is just so gratifying. Before I dive in, I do want to preface with a couple of quick comments. The idea of this session is meaningful advising, knowing our students as a foundation for understanding. Knowing them as millennials is just one slice, obviously, of who they are. And there's a lot of generalizations in any slice when you're sort of trying to apply a collective to a group of students. So I really want to acknowledge that there is a lot of generalizations here. We're brushing with a very broad brush. I will add, though, that many of these generalizations are really substantiated in research. They're substantiated in the interviews I have done with both millennials and people who educate millennials, employ millennials, parent millennials, and so forth. So I really want to put that out there and make sure that you understand that. The other thing that I will add is I also recognize that we have some millennials in the room. We have some parents of millennials in the room. I hope that this is not a critical conversation about millennials as much as sort of just a way of looking at this particular cohort of students. But I will say, for sake of self-protection, we could have a critical conversation about any generation. I'm a proud member of Generation X. We look the worst in the research. We're jaded, we're cynical, we talk about the problems, not the solutions. So next time we'll talk about Gen X. Today we're going to focus on millennials, so let's just keep that in mind. I will also add that for the sake of time, we are going to dive into a lot of stuff. I'm really planting some seeds of thought. So this is really a superficial blush, and please keep that in mind. It also doesn't get at some of the dynamics because of time of what does it mean for some of our international millennials? So what does it mean for some of our domestic millennial students who are underrepresented in our community? I try and get a little bit at that, but we're limited in all that we can talk about here. So with that, I will actually dive into content. So it is important to understand this notion of generational studies, right? So one of the things to understand about generational studies is that it is suggesting that generations actually have an identifier based on birth span, but that carry with it values, beliefs, life experiences, attitudes, and that come from formative experiences that happen mostly throughout their childhood years. And of course, Lancaster and Stillman talk about the fact that generations aren't going to become more alike as they get older. Those values, those attributes are actually going to become more deeper ingrained as one gets older. We sort of become more of who we are as we age. Whether that's good or bad is up to all of you. I want you to think about what are some of the things that come to your mind when you think about millennials, the things that we're told by media, the things that come from our experience of working with students. Again, some of these generalizations. Some of these words that are up there are things that we hear quite commonly. Things that when we're sitting around tables with each other are often things that we are talking about. So these are some thoughts to think about how we perceive them, whether all of them are fair or not. And I would add that you see it's really across a wide spectrum of concepts here. Let me just say that the slide decks will all be available, both this one and for the next session afterwards, so certainly don't feel like you have to scribe or whatever. It'll all be on the Symposium website. Really building on these common perceptions that are held, perhaps some of you saw the Time magazine article that came out almost a couple of years ago where they talked about the me generation. Millennials are lazy, entitled, narcissists who still live with their parents. Why they'll save us all. So not only is that incendiary, but it also really sparks some kind of controversial ideas and across sort of a broad paradigm here. It's an interesting article. It was one of the suggested pre-readings to present one point of view. You may have noticed there was another article that presented perhaps a different point of view. I now want to really move from these perceptions that we hold to a little bit of basic information about millennials. First and foremost, the birth year span, and depending upon which researcher you follow, it's going to vary perhaps up to 2 or 3 years on either end. I sort of use the years that were designated by Neil Howe and William Strauss, who are generational researchers. Actually, Neil Howe passed away a few years ago. No, I'm sorry, William Strauss passed away a few years ago. Neil is still around. They defined generations even before millennials hit the forefront, and they're the ones who named the generation as millennials. You may also hear them referred to as Generation Y. That's somewhat common. Baby boomlets, echo boomers. But millennials has really stuck. They define the birth years as 1982 to 2002. Right now, there are over 1 billion millennials alive around the world today, so they are the largest generation in the world. They are racially and ethnically more diverse than any previous generation. In fact, according to Pew Research Center just last year, 43% of millennial adults are non-white. That is just one reflection of their diversity, and the diversity is growing. One thing we need to recognize is actually more and more our millennial students and those who are coming up after them are actually bi or multiracial or ethnic, and that's another element of identity that we need to gain a better understanding of. So the early millennials were raised by baby boomers. The next wave were raised by people like me, thus jaded, cynical Gen Xers. With the millennial generation, there was sort of more of this societal focus on family and the needs of children. Not that children were unimportant before, but like I think about the lexicon of my childhood. Latchkey kid, does anyone remember the term? Okay. Versus soccer mom. It takes a village. Things like the No Child Left Behind Act, right? So there are things that really reflect a different kind of focus on how we need to really care much more about our children. A lot of nurturing and protection, and we'll talk more about that, but I love this little cartoon that sort of underscribes some of this. My mom says you can sleep in the top bunk if your parents will sign a release form. A lot of pressure around achievement, and highly programmed. And by that I mean, and this is relevant particularly with our students, where their childhood was that of structured activities created for them, delivered to them, and presided over by adult authority. That is going to ingrain in a lot of ways, both their expectations about us, their sense of self-efficacy, which we'll get to. There is a lot of stuff here that comes from how structured their life is, going from sort of structured activity to structured activity with very little downtime, very little time for reflection, which I think is a critical notion. No one would argue their technological orientation, and we also see that college attendance has continued to rise. Again, by Pew, and this is a couple of years old, but we can see the differences between 1968 and 2012, the level of educational attainment across the country. So I, in my research, in my writing, in my presentations, tend to put a variety of sort of lenses on millennials. And I'm going to quickly talk about these, and then we're going to focus on a few. One of them is the hover generation, that parental involvement. We've all heard about helicopter parents, maybe even Black Hawk parents, which is that special breed of helicopter parent that strikes sometimes, right? Submarine parents who torpedo you. I like the term, and this is particularly resonant today, snowplow parents. I tried to explain snowplow parents in the Dominican Republic where it doesn't really snow, so you can imagine how difficult that was. But really the parents who are essentially proceeding in the path of the child, clearing it of hurdles and obstacles. That old idiom, you prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child, is something I have great concern about its sort of expiration. Is it becoming a little extinct? I think of detriment to our children. Generation RX, which gets at issues of heightened mental health concerns for the millennial generation. I'll talk more about that. The celebrated generation, that kind of notion of every kid gets a trophy. Every non-event is kind of rewarded. That gets internalized. It builds a set of expectations. We see that in the workplace about what we want, what millennial employees are looking for in terms of rewards and accolades. The program generation, as I talked about before, that sort of hyper-programming that leaves, again, very little time for reflection, very little time to contemplate. And we know from research that that is what builds a better sense of self and even coping mechanisms. Generation optimistic, this positive view of the world, this sense not only that they have the ability to make positive change in the world, but actually that is what is expected of them as a generation. Across pretty much all the millennials I've interviewed talk about that is what they feel is their obligation to society. And finally, generation 2.0, which talks again about that technological orientation, which we'll get into a little bit more as well. They are certainly among the most, really the most highly tech-oriented generation, both in terms of their knowledge and their perspective. So let's dig in on a few of these issues just a little bit. Let's talk about mental health. So emotional and psychiatric issues are indeed becoming more important. Things that I would call garden variety issues, sort of low-grade depression, some anxiety, we are seeing much more of that among our students. I suspect that is not a surprise to any of you in this room. We are seeing much more of that. We're also seeing greater volume and deeper significance of issues. And it's important to note that this is consistent across many, many different spheres. Nationalities, we're seeing the increases in anxiety, neuroticism, and other measures here. So this is consistent across many, many demographic areas. One question that also often comes up is, well, is it time of life, right? Is it about this stage of development, which sure it is, or is it specific to this generation? Well, it's heightened in this generation. There's tons of data about this. I could go on forever, but I really want to focus on the fact that we are seeing it as a difference to previous generations. So this study in the Clinical Psychology Review actually looked at this issue of mental health and mental health concerns over decades. And we do see that 5 times as many students in 2007 surpassed these thresholds for mental health concerns compared with students in 1938. That is huge, a huge leap across 70 years. There were 2 specific categories that were particularly heightened. hypomania, which is characterized as anxiety or unrealistic optimism, and depression. Those grew at an even higher rate, 6 times the level of those in 1938. And the number of students, both in high school and college, who are scoring very high, not just high, but very high on the MMPI depression scale, increased from 1% to 8%. An 8-fold increase. That is very significant. So I think that's important to understand that it's not just about stage of life, which is critical. This is, as we know, a very critical developmental stage, but there's something that's heightening this. I tie it to a number of factors. That snowplow parenting isn't helping. That lack of reflection time is not helping. There's many, many things that are contributing to this. In fact, and this goes back a few years, every 2 years, SCUP, the Society for College and University Planning, puts out trends for higher education. And in 2008, their report actually considered mental health as a demographic issue. And not just that, they actually cited it as the #1 demographic issue. And this is a quote that came out of that study. The mental health of students attending college is increasingly becoming a cause for concern in both the US and Canada, which is where they focus. The number of students who seek and need mental health services is only likely to rise. Increased awareness and decreased stigmatization contribute, but doesn't explain it all. And I think that's a very telling statement. So I also want to bring up a quote from a millennial who I interviewed. And this was a young millennial new to the workplace who actually talked about bringing personal and emotional concerns to work, not being prepared for certain situations, getting stressed out, the anxiety, breaking down in front of coworkers, crying at her desk. I would add her desk was in a cubicle environment. So very public demonstrations of this. And she closed by saying, I do believe that my millennial peers and I need more guidance on how to deal with stressful workplace issues. That is something to think about as we think about meaningful advising with our students. So let's talk about technology. Another charming cartoon. This requires both ears. I feel like I've been in that situation 1,000 times, right? For faculty in the room, I don't know if you actually have to tell students to take their earbuds out in class. I don't know. I would hope not. That would horrify me. John Palfrey and Urs Gasser wrote a great book called Born Digital, Understanding the First Generation of Digital Natives. This generation is digital natives. This is what they have always known. I'm a digital immigrant. I aged into it, right? This uber technological environment. And they really nail it. Major aspects of their lives, social interactions, friendships, civic activities are mediated by digital technology, mediated. Most notable, however, is the way the digital era has transformed how people live their lives and relate to one another and the world. I think this is something actually where we are learning from the younger generation. Usually you kind of teach down, but we all do it. We all have that, phone almost surgically implanted at the end of our hands, right? It really is becoming acculturated and informing the way in which we look at and interface with the world, particularly if you're a digital native. So they are the first generation to actually have grown up with computers and the internet. That informs their experience of and the way they interact as a user. They bring expertise and a comfort level that some of us can't even begin to imagine. And as a result of that, they have very high expectations for how we use technology to interface with them and the platforms they will be using. We have all seen when they get incredibly frustrated, and perhaps rightfully so, by what feels outdated or clumsy or inefficient or not working, even truly broken. I want to get at what I think is some incredibly interesting research about multitasking. We all talk about multitasking. I'm a good multitasker. I'm a bad multitasker. These researchers at Stanford University a few years ago did a study on what they called chronic media multitaskers. So that's different from what we might call task multitasking. So task multitasking, maybe tonight when I go home, I'm going to wash some dishes and I might talk on the phone at the same time, and then I'm going to go do something else. But while I'm also, got things happening and on those fronts, That's different from media multitasking, where you are actually perhaps like working on a spreadsheet and going back and forth to a paper and IMing someone or Facebook messaging someone at the same time and texting on your phone, right? All kind of weaving in and out simultaneously. And what's important to know is that they did not study their groups while they were multitasking. They studied them while they weren't, to get a sense of its impact on them, right? So one of the things that they found is that their cognitive processing skills were lessened than the control group. That's sort of essentially like information literacy, being able to discern what's important and what's not important. They really called these chronic media multitaskers suckers for the irrelevant. So that ability to kind of focus. The management of working memory. I think sort of my memory is almost like a file cabinet that's getting worse and worse, but not every piece of information is right there. I kind of have to think for a second and think, what drawer in the file cabinet do I need to go to? And then like, what folder within the drawer do I need to pull out? Like, how do I retrieve that piece of information? Well, these media multitaskers had a much worse working memory than the non-multitaskers. And finally, just what you think they might be better at, kind of the seamless shifting from task to task, they were actually worse at. So that's some damning evidence, right? I would add a few things to the list. The ability to deal with uncertainty, right? This is a generation that was brought up maybe being able to find the answer to something a few quick keystrokes away, or a quick phone tapping away. So being able to sit with not knowing something, not having the answer to a difficult situation. That reflection that we talked about earlier, the ability to kind of sit and think. Even the times that aren't hyper-programmed in the way that we talked about, it is filled by media noise. So downtime isn't even downtime anymore. And patience, being able to sit and wait for an answer. How many of us have gotten an email at 3 in the morning looking for an answer to something, and when we haven't responded by 8:15 a.m., they have emailed again, I'm waiting for my answer, right? So I believe that this is an internalization of some of these issues. It's how it has formed the way in which they approach things. It does inform what they are looking for from us. They want customization, and it's not just in the products that they buy. It's also in the academic programs and leadership opportunities that we provide. They want to even have a hand in designing curriculum. They want smaller class sizes, high-touch approach from their faculty and the staff with whom they interface, the advisors. They want creative programming across all fronts, and particularly career development. They want unique experiences. They want to be active learners, which is part of that high-touch approach, and they want us to appeal to their value system and what's important to them. So this is some of the ways that we can think about how it's informing their outlook on the world, and how can we respond a little bit. So let's talk about parental involvement. I've lived this 1,000 times. I can't imagine that others haven't. I'll read it out loud. I realize it's hard to see. Yes, mother, I told you I'm doing fine on my own at college. Hey, could you log on and find my schedule, order my books, and call me when it's time for class? I cannot count on 2 hands and 2 feet how many times I've been asked by a parent if I can wake up their child for class because their child has trouble getting up in the morning. I have trouble getting up in the morning. I can only be responsible for myself. I can't wake up everybody else. This is some of what we're seeing about this, and that's a little bit of snowplow parenting. Let's be fair to parents, including all of you who are parents in the room. There is some strong societal messages. Boston Magazine, the best schools, gotta start them young. Why it's never too early to stress about your child's education. The Hub's top preschools. That's a very serious message. And good parenting, I think, is being defined for parents as advocating at all costs for your child, taking care of everything, making sure that they are okay, not giving them the skills to do some of that. That's some of the messaging that they're getting, and this is obviously just one example of that. So one of the people I interviewed, who was actually a job coach, talked about a seminar that she was at with 200 college recruiters. More than half of them said that they had spoken with a parent during the recruiting process. Colleagues with whom I work, people who I've interviewed, talk about asking about students, prospective employees, asking for offer letters to be sent to their parents instead of to them. If I'm making a job change, I actually even still talk about it a little bit with my parents. I like to talk about it. I like their input. That's fine. They're not making the decision for me. And maybe when you're 21, your parents are really helping you make the decision even more. But that it feels acceptable to ask for your parents to take over it from the eyes of the person hiring you is very troublesome. That should not be the societal norm, and it's something we really need to fight against. So Hara Estraf Morano, in a book called A Nation of Wimps, The High Cost of Invasive Parenting, talked about something that I think is really important. And it is about this notion of what parents, it's, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Pardon my use of that. Parents are anxious and hyper attentive to their kids, reacting to every little blip of their child's day, eager to solve every problem for their child, and believe that that is good parenting. And that's the message that they're getting for whatever reason. I think it's the wrong message, though. So let's get into this notion of developing their self-efficacy, which both Beth and Lori sort of got at in their introductory remarks. Success is really valued by this generation, and it's rewarded. So this whole, the trophy kid thing, right? So that great research journal, People magazine, had an article a few years ago that discussed several communities, not just one, but multiple communities, where students were getting rewarded with prizes or raffle tickets to win prizes for doing things like going to school, being on time for class. If you had a good attendance record, the better your attendance record, the more opportunities to win something you could earn. So really getting rewarded for a non-achievement, getting rewarded for what is the basic of your job. Think about how that might translate into our young employees or even our student employees or our students who are looking for those kinds of accolades for kind of doing the minimum, doing what is standardly accepted. It results sometimes in this resentment when this confidence that's instilled or the hard work that they are legitimately providing doesn't bring about the rewards that they expect. 40% of young millennials believe that they should be promoted every 2 years, regardless of job performance. Regardless of job performance. I think that this ties very much into the lack of time for and also our societal emphasis on reflection. We need to place more emphasis on that. And I think when we think about meaningful advising with our students, that's a place to import more emphasis into their lives. There's a legitimate question here of have we become a results-driven society where if we can't put it on a resume, it doesn't mean anything, right? That's an important question to ask and to ask us how we are framing that for our students. We know, it's well documented in literature, that childhood stress, which can happen from some of this hyper-programming and some of the other issues we talked about, is really a significant factor in young adult depression. It can lead to that. And as Madeline Levine wrote in her book, The Price of Privilege, kids can't find the time, both literal and psychological, to linger in internal exploration, a necessary precursor to a well-developed sense of self. Maybe let's turn to something slightly more optimistic for a second. I always feel like sort of, the depressing person up here. Many in this generation are really typified as being well-educated, entrepreneurial, idealistic, technologically savvy. They want to take risks. They want to change the world. They want to imbue their passions into what they do. It's part of their identity. The lines between personal passion and professional expectations are kind of dissolving right now, and that's a good thing. The commitment to doing good in the workplace is becoming a new norm that will define this generation. They're driving fundamental change in the way we think about corporate culture and the impact in the social sector that companies can have and that employees within those companies can provide. That is an incredibly wonderful stamp on the millennials. We need to capitalize on that. So I'm actually going to toss out a few things here that come actually from the National Study of Student Engagement, NSSE, this last year, and in fact some quotes from our students about their expectations in the workplace, in this environment. You're going to see some words that I particularly highlighted, and I've chosen ones that talk about what they want more of, not what they feel is fully satisfied, because I think it's easy to rest on our laurels of the stuff that we're nailing, right? It's important to see what they're asking for more of. So, My issue with the advising system is a difficult one. I don't think my advisor tries to build a relationship with me. Relationship. It would be nice to develop a more personal one-on-one relationship with an advisor to help me through some of the questions I had about my future. My future, not just planning, which is mentioned, but my future. By the way, FY reflects first year, SR senior. My biggest complaint about BU is that professors don't have time to be mentors, right? That they're looking for mentorship. I would like to have seen more professors and faculty, aside from 2 or 3 I had, get more involved with students. By email or phone, I thought was interesting. By email or phone. Assigned advisors through the entire 4-year experience would be extremely helpful and make the meetings more meaningful, right? Advisors need to be more integrated within student life and more personable relationships made. Relationships again. They want the integration into their lives. This is stuff that they're asking for. Now, they're also asking for the other stuff. As Lori said, it wasn't a matter of instead of, it's not a replacement, it's an enhancement. But they want this, they are seeking this. And they want the quick transactions. That patience thing is really an issue. But I think part of it is we have to dig beneath that superficial question. We have to go from what they're coming in actually asking by asking those great questions, the why, the what, to really get a sense of what's underlying this. And that gets at relationships, mentorship, meaningful. So we want to consider some different issues. I know that there's been a lot put out there, and I promise you, I could talk for days about this. And many of my colleagues and my family know this, and they have to suffer the price of that. We don't have time to talk for days, although certainly come see me afterwards, because I am always happy to talk for days. I really wanted to give some ideas within this topic to think about. So at your tables, you have a talented and well-placed facilitator. They are going to, if they haven't already, distributed unique questions for your tables, and then you're going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back together and do some report outs. From wandering the room, it looks like there is tremendous conversation happening at tables.
Luke.
And I regret interrupting those, because it's so nice to listen to them. But I think I'm curious, at least, and I imagine others are, to hear more broadly what's being talked about at the tables. So the way I'm going to do this, actually, like I said, we have facilitators at each table who I hope all of you know at this point are going to report out kind of one sort of primary idea. And we're going to do this quickly because we want to try and hear from everybody if we can. So what I'm going to do is go through question by question in order to make it easier for everybody. And Stacy has a mic. We have a mic over there. Kelly has a mic. Excellent. So when I mention your question, kind of flag so that your voice can be heard also with the recording. So let's start, and I'm going to quickly, so that everybody knows kind of what the questions are, I've got them up on the screen, and you can read them, but I'm essentially going to say that question 1 kind of gets at motivation and that sense of self-efficacy. And so I put it out there. A table that had question 1, there we go, Ruthie has question 1.
Hello, everyone. We had question 1 talking about intentionality and self-efficacy. And one of the main points we came up is really from one of Rachel's comments is putting it back onto the student and asking, what does it mean to you? Do you see yourself as an intentional person through your education here? And one of our main talking through that, one of our main points was, as our roles as advisors, it's important for us to sort of summarize, normalize, be there as a constant support for that student, follow up, being comfortable in the awkward silent space, leaving the question hanging and biting your tongue and not answering it, just being there.
That's such a great point. I have a lot of discomfort in that silent space. I heard a lot of like, oh yeah, around the room. I think that's a great point. Somebody else with question 1. Yes.
So we talked about that we don't necessarily think that they are using college to prepare for life intentionally, that they are realizing slowly as their time goes on here that that they're learning lessons whether they're intending to or not. I think the thing that we sort of came up with is how we can help is engagement, and not necessarily task-driven engagement, setting more and more structure for them, but more social engagement within our departments, and that they do learn from each other as well as from us. And so getting the students who may be on the outskirts of the department or whatever they're studying fully engaged within the work that they're doing, and that as advisors, the tone that we take is important in terms of empathy and creating that relationship or that meaningful relationship, but that the idea of discipline and self-reliant thinking it still, I think, has to be there in order for them to become adults that can go on and implement those things once they graduate and think for themselves. So I think it's also about the tone that we take with them rather than us answering questions for them.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of, particularly this starting college, they may have ideas about what they want their life to look like, but it often is at the most superficial. I want this job or I want this career, which doesn't always fit with actually what they want their life to look like. So that's so important. I know we've got at least one other question 1 table. Yes.
We had similar conversations at our table. We also don't believe that most of them are consciously using this time intentionally to build independence, but sometimes it happens, whether they expect it or not. And we talked about opportunities that do that, things like study abroad and internships and things that push them out of their comfort zone. And we talked about box checkers versus deep thinkers, and sort of being able to establish relationships with both and what questions you ask each of those students and really engage them. And we talked about turning transactional interactions into meaningful conversations with simple questions. And we talked about sometimes as advisors in different ways we give some students homework and like, okay, go do the following things and come back, and forcing that reflection in some ways.
So, a box checker, giving them that homework and having them come back to see you is a great way of reaching that box checker, because that's another box to check, right? But you're building that meaningful interaction. Do we have another question 1 out there? Okay, I think we're on to question 2, which is really about technology and this question of how do we relate to them, their use of technology, and how do we engage with them, perhaps using technology as a vehicle in kind of under today's current situation. So who's got it? There we go. Anna and Tom, you're right near both of them. Stacy, excellent.
Hi, I think we seem to be talking a lot about confusion at our table, I would say, and how, first of all, the difficulty that either with small groups or large groups of students we have in reaching out to them via email, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and stuff, and just the fact that sometimes it's hard to know whether how the most important things are getting through, and that's something that we're all kind of managing right now. The other thing that, so it was great to hear different people's approaches. One question is email like a professional thing and Twitter a personal thing? Do people divide up their kind of medium media according to parts of their lives? The other thing that was a great suggestion was just having younger people come in to classrooms or to advisors to sort of help us show us old folks how to use things that we would just don't know how to use, and to really kind of open our minds to the possibilities that are available now that we don't really know about.
That's a great thought. Reverse mentorship. We have thousands of mentors walking around among us who can help us understand, how do I reach you? How can I be connecting with you? That's a lesson for me, for sure. Another question too. Excellent. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. We in our group talked a lot about how do we meet the students where they're at, but also sort of educate them on, what might be something that they can learn from us in terms of advising. How do we sort of create meaningful advising, as one of Rachel's quotes was, via email or phone? And so what we came up with was perhaps we could do virtual advising to begin a relationship with a student who then feels that they've built a relationship with someone, and when we need them to come in and meet with us, they're not as resistant to do so. We also talked about personalizing the communication. So, a lot of times when we send messages through Blackboard or the link, it's sort of a generic message that goes out to everyone, but just making a small change and sending a message through mail merge and personalizing it so that they think it's just going to them can make a huge difference in the response that you get, and we've all experienced that in terms of doing that we get a much more robust response from students when they think that we're reaching just to them.
Absolutely. And even if they're savvy enough, as many of them are, to realize that it was a mail merge, because they often know how to do that, it gets back to what they expect of our use of technology. It at least shows that we kind of know what we're doing and we're putting forth more effort. Those bulk emails, they're like, seriously, really? So it's a way of showing like we are interfacing in a way that we can use some basic technology, quite frankly. But I struggle a lot with this. The train is out of the station on some of this stuff. So we have to get on board, but use that train, use getting on board to maybe help, direct it, be a conductor. Tom, I know, also had this question.
So we focused quite a bit on the first question of the first paragraph of the two of them, and looking at the time management issues that students are facing, and actually trying to use some of the qualities you described about the generation, which is to teach them to reward themselves by turning off Facebook for a little while and focusing on their reading materials. And this is being done through a variety of offices, through advising in the ERC and even with website materials. And as we developed that conversation and then spent a lot of time focusing on this lack of reflection that you spoke about with this generation and trying to figure out how to deal with it. We got a strong recommendation. Everybody needs to take one philosophy course at least. But where we actually ended up talking about is chunking the emails, making them shorter, putting them images, turning them into PDFs and other materials. And ultimately, we ended up starting actually to talk about, is there content that we want students to learn before they arrive or just when they arrive on campus? And is there some kind of mandatory online content that we can introduce students to just as they arrive or just before they arrive, and reward them, of course, for doing that?
Of course. Excellent. Thank you. Was there another table with this technology question?
So our group talked a little bit about the infrastructure, such as Google Hangouts for doing virtual office hours, and we all agreed that that needs to be greatly improved. But we also pointed out that it's hard to know just when a student is too stressed out to interact with you virtually, and that they do need to come in and you do need to really have that very personalized engagement with them. So we felt that some assistance to advisors on knowing where that boundary is when personal interaction was necessary.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move on to question 3, which is a long one. So it's up on the screen. It presents a scenario that really is about mental health and working with a student about how to work through some of the issues and how it affects academics as well as sort of a more broad question about what do these mental health issues mean for advising. So I'm going to look to our question 3 people. I know Steve is one, so is Eric. Doris is one. Great, Doris already has a mic.
Okay, so there's a lot in this question, and there's a question and there's an example. So the first question was, what does this mean for advising? Like, how are we handling mental health in advising? And so we discussed how meaningful advising in this case really includes helping students with taking leaves and getting help and managing self-care, but also understanding the consequences toward adulthood. So in this particular example, the student is at the point of expulsion and is trying to show that he's really made a breakthrough. And so we discussed how even if a student has hit a breakthrough, they still need time for self-care before they would be even ready for school. And in this example, it's a little too late. We want to be able to show them also that there are consequences in waiting for too long to get help. So that's a step in adulthood as well.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, Steve.
So our group talked about the fact that we're all kind of in the role now of making decisions about students' mental health, and the fact that they're more forthcoming and more open, and sharing this information puts advisors and faculty and staff in a position of now interpreting and making decisions. And we had one scenario of one of our faculty members who got a Snapchat or a shot of a student's prescription bottle sent along with a request to, I think, get more time on an exam. And so I think it speaks to that issue. What are we obligated? What's our obligation as students and families are more open about mental health concerns and coming to BU with an expectation, and we have an excellent reputation for working with students in distress. What does that mean to our policies and our rules and the accommodations we make? So I think the takeaway for me and for the table was, at least in my colleges, I think the advisors could play more of a role helping faculty when they are confronted with students and these issues. Not that we're the experts, but we can sort of centralize the process and respond in ways that a faculty member shouldn't be expected to
Sure, a facilitator of understanding, absolutely. I'm looking for another table on this topic. Eric has...
right away, or they come sooner or later. And what we've noticed is we've also been put in binds often, where we're trying to figure out if we are made to be responsible for this situation, and actually sometimes we're even blamed if something comes up. So I think what we did is we thought a lot about how do we deal with that, how do we put the responsibility back on the student. We hope it doesn't get to this situation. We try to probably intervene a little bit earlier throughout the process, and I think that one of the things we thought of was some form of contracting with the students. Whether that's part of a formal process, like a success programming thing, or just individually contracting with the student and coming up with ideas and resources with them and trying to get them to ask and answer their own questions. And I think that one of the key things we also found was that there needs to be some kind of follow-up process. So like creating something where you meet with the person frequently. So yeah, that's just a couple of our ideas.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. I worked at an institution where we actually used what we called behavioral agreements with students, which carry with it a lot of difficult stuff, but that would go across both their academic and their sort of student affairs experience at the college. Is there another table with question 3? It's just hard to remember, 17 tables. Okay, so let's move on to 4. And 4 gets at this parental involvement piece. And I'll leave it at that. There's a lot here, but please share with us.
So we, on question 4, snowplow parents are real, for sure. And we are so thankful for FERPA, for sure. But we talked a lot about when students first come to BU and when parents first come to BU to kind of inform them of all the resources that BU has. So trust that your students can go to the resources that we're giving them, and also to reinforce the fact that students and parents should talk to each other, and then we don't always have to be the middleman here. And I know that's scary for students, and we've talked about that. You know, some parents are very scary. I've had personal experiences with them, but we have to be, you know, we have to kind of enforce to the parents or reinforce to the parents that they're becoming adults. We need to let them fly, and to you know, to trust BU and who we hire.
Yeah. And I think that's the critical thing, right? I mean, we want to be careful about just sort of trotting out FERPA without any context, but really explain our underpinnings for how we employ FERPA, how we interpret and stand by FERPA in terms of educating for adulthood and the role that we want the student to take in this, and not just have it be, I can't talk to you because of FERPA, and that's it.
I'm not sure I did my homework on this one. I don't have one takeaway, but I'll just boil it down. I think the take-home, if I can try to boil it down, for the table, I was at a bit of a disadvantage because I'm not a mom, and nor am I a mom of a millennial, but was really to empower the students. And the question, of course, is how do you do that? And it's to try to have that conversation, to convince them that a part of this process, a part of what you're doing in that advising relationship and in that conversation, as well as a part of what we're doing in the classroom, is to encourage them to ask those questions, as has been mentioned earlier, and as I think we all recognize the value of that. So it's just getting students to appreciate that that's something you just need to do. And then when it comes to the parents, that you get those phone calls from, I think the other thing that came up was to assure the parents that you're having that conversation with their child, and to also encourage the parent that if your child isn't coming to you to have that conversation, that you need to have that conversation with your child as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, good boiling. Any other question for us? Okay, Vicki.
I have a microphone, so I'll start. So I guess just to join in on what's already been said, I think it comes back down to knowledge and empathy to ensure the parents that the students are really in a position to be able to think through these issues themselves, but also to show some empathy for the parents who are suffering from anxiety around their kids. So maybe through the conversation with the parents, it's about acknowledging that. It's hard letting go, it is. And by saying that, that can redirect them to be thinking about what they need to be thinking about. And so when talking with students, the energy can be spent with them addressing the issues that are academic.
Absolutely. And you know, we have to acknowledge, even as we sort of talk about what we're limited in discussing with parents, they have a huge investment, and it's not just financial. The financial investment is big, but this is their kid. It's very emotional. So we have to keep rolling along. I'm going to keep us doing that. We have only a few more minutes, and we want to try and hear from everybody. So just concisely, thank you, Vicki.
Very concisely. Okay, here we go. Idea one was point of contact right away. We want to lead by example. So if the parent is asking you a question at an open house, answering it to the student. The second idea was if a student asks if a parent can be a part of a conversation, trying to have it just with the student, having the student give the parents those answers so the parents have less anxiety because they understand that their child actually can handle a meeting and can report back and answer all their questions. And then in lieu with open house was to potentially have part of the open house be for parents and students and have it part of it just be for the student.
Thank you. Excellent. So question 5 gets at really this sort of very cerebral concept of global citizenship. And as we educate our students for adulthood, really what is their place in the world? So Faith, I know, has a question 5.
Yes, so we talked a lot about how intentionality is very important. A lot of our students are going to classes with a very diverse international population and they're studying abroad, but they're not always making use of those times to actually get to know people who are from other countries. You could actually go to London and do a lot to not meet anybody who's British if you try hard enough. And so we thought that it was really important that our students, as we advise them, that we talk to them about the importance of actually getting to know the local culture when they go abroad, and then as faculty that they can do a little bit more to infuse topics and conversations within class so that students are talking about important concepts with students internationally. That was our main
Great.
point.
Thank you. Can you pass off to Cece, who's right there?
So we had a discussion about students' sense of globalization and whether that's a false sense of globalization, because so many students do go abroad, even to non-English speaking countries, but they're still taught classes in English. And so they have this false sense of knowing another culture without actually, we discussed about how they can't be comfortable with other cultures Instead, they need to first be uncomfortable to progress past that. And then we also talked about how they have this sense of wanting to do good in the world, but that their intentions aren't quite fully formed. They want to do good, but they don't know how they want to do good or how they can do good. And we discussed how they first need to have a skill in order to do good with that skill. And we also, let me see my notes. Basically just that sense of trying to help them make those decisions now in order to have that further sense. But it was that kind of idea that we're not quite sure how to get them there yet.
Thank you. Yes.
We talked about many of the same issues surrounding students talking to one another in the classroom and kind of creating an environment to encourage curiosity and open-mindedness in discussion. That idea that just because we are a very diverse campus, that doesn't mean they graduate with a sense of global competence. Also, in terms of study abroad, we talked about maybe encouraging more of the service learning study abroad programs. We do have some in place, but again, we also mentioned that idea that their motivation in going abroad, even for one of those programs, might not quite be on target. And then finally, we talked about some programs we already have on campus, like the Howard Thurman Center, which has great programming that could be a resource for bringing some of these issues to the forefront. And then also an idea about maybe creating a portfolio. So they're thinking about these global issues in their classes, in their community service, in their internships, in their study abroad, and having that space for contemplation.
Excellent. I think the weaving in our own understanding and knowledge base of the resources and finding ways to integrate that into our conversations. I think I've hit every table. So this is great. So much tremendous food for thought for me, and I hope for all of you. I really want to thank all of these people, many of whom helped form the content, identify what was most critical to discuss here today, crafted the questions for the discussion, and obviously facilitated the discussion. So thank you all so much, and thank all of you. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. About 10 of, and you're going to come back and you're going to go to your second table. To Stacy's earlier point, we want to use this as an opportunity to connect with one another.